After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States was thrown into a war it had not fully prepared for. But at that moment, its focus was entirely on Japan. The American people were furious, their navy battered, and their government united in a call for revenge. Yet technically, the United States was still not at war with Nazi Germany. Hitler could have let America bleed its strength in the Pacific, fighting Japan across islands and seas thousands of miles away. He could have bought himself time to finish his campaign in the Soviet Union, consolidate his grip on Europe, and prepare for the eventual clash with America. Instead, in a shocking move that stunned even his own advisors, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States on December 11th, just 4 days after Pearl Harbor. It was one of the most reckless gambles of his career, and it is remembered as one of the greatest strategic mistakes of World War II. To understand why, we need to step back into Hitler's mindset and the fragile position of the world in late 1941. At that point, Nazi Germany was still at the peak of its power. Hitler had conquered most of continental Europe, humiliated France, and driven Britain to the brink of collapse. His armies had invaded the Soviet Union in June of that year, and were pressing deep into Russian territory. By December, they stood outside the gates of Moscow. To many in Germany, victory seemed within reach. But it was also at this very moment that Hitler faced problems that were far larger than they appeared on the surface. His armies in the Soviet Union were overextended, exhausted, and not equipped for the brutal Russian winter. Supplies lagged behind, and German industry, though powerful, was already straining to meet the demands of a global war. Now, imagine this situation. Hitler has his hands full with the Soviet Union. Britain is still resisting in the West. And America, though not yet officially at war with Germany, is already supplying Britain and the Soviets with enormous amounts of material through the Lend-Lease Act. Convoys of food, trucks, planes, and tanks are crossing the Atlantic every day. German U-boats sink some, but far from enough. Hitler sees this and believes America is already, in effect, at war with him. In his mind, a formal declaration simply matches reality. But here's the fatal miscalculation. The United States in late 1941 was a sleeping giant, a country with enormous untapped potential. Its economy dwarfed that of Germany and Japan combined. Its factories still recovering from the Great Depression. Were ready to shift into wartime production at a scale the world had never seen. Its population was vast, its natural resources unmatched, and its industrial capacity almost limitless. Hitler understood America's size but underestimated its willpower. He believed the United States was a divided, distracted country too focused on Japan and too isolated to play a major role in Europe. He thought Americans were soft, unwilling to endure the sacrifices of war. This was not the first time Hitler had underestimated an enemy, but with the United States, it was catastrophic. By declaring war, he handed President Franklin D. Roosevelt exactly what he wanted. Up to that point, Roosevelt had struggled against isolationist voices in America who argued that the U.S. should stay out of Europe's wars. Pearl Harbor changed that mood overnight, but there was still a question: should America fight only Japan or also Germany? When Hitler declared war, that question disappeared. Roosevelt could now rally the American people to fight in both the Pacific and Europe, uniting them in a total war against the Axis. Think about the difference this made. If Hitler had stayed silent, Roosevelt would have had to justify a European war to a public already consumed with anger at Japan. America might have delayed sending full-scale armies into Europe. Hitler could have bought himself time, perhaps years. Instead, his declaration created the very nightmare Germany had tried to avoid: a two-front war against both the Soviet Union in the East and the United States and Britain in the West. The shock of this declaration rippled across the world. Even many German officials were baffled. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, scrambled to spin the decision, framing it as loyalty to Japan and as a bold move against a weak, materialistic America. German generals, already desperate for reinforcements in Russia, quietly wondered how they could possibly win against another industrial giant. Meanwhile, in Washington and London, the reaction was almost disbelief. Churchill famously said he went to bed that night content because Hitler's declaration meant Britain would no longer have to beg America to join the European fight. The decision had united the Allies in a way no diplomatic maneuver ever could. From a purely military standpoint, Hitler's move also unleashed the full might of the U.S. Navy against Germany's U-boats in the Atlantic. Within months, American shipyards were producing Liberty ships, escort carriers, and destroyers at a staggering pace, overwhelming the German submarine campaign. The U-boat war, which had threatened Britain's survival, suddenly turned into a losing struggle for Germany. The flow of American troops, tanks, and supplies across the Atlantic only increased from there, building the foundation for the DID invasion just a few years later. But perhaps the most important consequence was psychological. Hitler's decision convinced the world that Germany's leadership was reckless and desperate. To neutral countries, it was proof that the Axis powers could not be trusted. To the Allies, it was proof that the war could be won if they held on and coordinated their efforts. And to the American people, it provided clarity. The war was not just about Japan, but about the survival of democracy itself against dictatorships in both Europe and Asia. Looking back, historians have debated whether Hitler's decision was driven by ideology, arrogance, or desperation. The truth is likely a mix of all three. He believed in the inevitability of a global clash with the United States, and his worldview convinced him that acting boldly was better than waiting. But in trying to control the future, he sealed his own fate. The shocking declaration of December 11, 1941, stands as one of the greatest strategic blunders in modern history. It transformed America from a regional participant into the central power of the Allied coalition. It guaranteed that Germany would face a war it could not hope to win against enemies with resources it could never match. And it ensured that Adolf Hitler, who once seemed unstoppable, had set his course toward inevitable defeat. And that's just the beginning of this story. If you're fascinated by the decisions that shaped the world and the blunders that changed history forever, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we bring you the most unexpected twists of the past. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States was not just shocking, it was a catastrophic miscalculation that reshaped the entire conflict. In his mind, the decision made sense. He believed the United States was too far away, too distracted, and too tied down in the Pacific to make a serious impact in Europe. He also had a deep, almost unshakable faith in Germany's U-boat fleet. These submarines had already been terrorizing the Atlantic, and Hitler was convinced they could sink enough American ships to cut off Britain from supplies and starve the Soviet Union of the resources it desperately needed. On paper, his logic might have looked convincing. The U.S. Navy had been caught off guard at Pearl Harbor, and most Americans were bracing for a long, brutal campaign against Japan. To Hitler, it seemed obvious that America would pour its strength into the Pacific first. That, he thought, would leave Europe safe from American armies for years to come. In those imagined years, Germany could finish off the Soviet Union, strangle Britain's lifeline, and build an empire strong enough to face any future American challenge. But what Hitler failed to grasp was the sheer scale and flexibility of the American war machine. The United States was not just another country entering the war. It was a continent-sized power with an industrial capacity unlike anything in history. Before Pearl Harbor, America's factories were already ramping up under the Lend-Lease program, supplying Britain and the Soviets with tanks, trucks, aircraft, and food. Once war was declared, that partial mobilization transformed into total war production. Think about the numbers for a moment. In 1941, Germany was producing thousands of aircraft a year, but the U.S. would soon outproduce it many times over. In shipbuilding, the comparison wasn't even close. American shipyards, spread across both coasts and inland waterways, could build Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. In fact, at the peak of production, some of these massive cargo ships were being launched in less than a week from keel to completion. For every ship that went down in the Atlantic, 2 more seemed to take its place. The German Navy simply could not keep up. Hitler's mistake was not just underestimating American industry. It was also underestimating the speed at which that industry could be converted for war. The U.S. government partnered with private companies in a way that shocked even its allies. Car factories stopped making cars and began rolling out tanks, jeeps, and bombers. Typewriter companies made rifles. Refrigerator companies produced airplane parts. Every sector of the economy shifted to serve the war effort, and the results came faster than anyone had predicted. By 1943, the United States was producing more war material than all the Axis powers combined. Now place yourself in Hitler's shoes for a moment. He imagined that U-boats prowling the Atlantic would choke off supply lines. He pictured Britain collapsing as food, oil, and weapons ran dry. He believed the Soviets would falter without American trucks, gasoline, and spare parts. But in reality, the U-boats entered what was known as their happy time, for only a brief window. In early 1942, German submarines sank dozens of American ships along the U.S. East Coast, even within sight of city lights. But this short-lived success ended once America adapted. Convoys became better organized, escorts multiplied, radar improved, and air patrols extended across the Atlantic. The Germans had imagined a long war of attrition at sea, but instead, they found themselves facing an enemy that could replace losses almost instantly, and was learning new tactics at a frightening pace. In other words, Hitler was gambling on America being too slow and too weak to respond. Instead, America was fast and overwhelming. His miscalculation also rested on assumptions about American society. He believed they were a nation of businessmen and consumers, lacking discipline, unwilling to sacrifice, and incapable of enduring the hardships of a world war. He also saw America as racially mixed, which to him meant disunity and weakness. These beliefs were not just offensive, they were dangerous. They blinded him to the reality of a country that could rally around a single cause when attacked. After Pearl Harbor, Americans, regardless of background, were united in a determination to fight until victory was secured. This underestimation of morale was just as damaging as his misreading of industry. For example, in the early months after Pearl Harbor, many in Germany expected American enthusiasm to fade as casualties mounted. But instead of collapsing, U.S. resolve hardened. The shock of Pearl Harbor created a sense of national purpose that Hitler never anticipated. The very thing he thought would limit America's focus on Japan ended up strengthening it. Americans embraced the idea of a two-front war, determined to strike back not just at Tokyo, but at Berlin as well. Meanwhile, Hitler's hope that his U-boats would dominate the Atlantic ran headfirst into America's industrial miracle. New ship designs, mass production, and innovations like escort carriers turned the tide quickly. By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had shifted decisively. Convoys were better protected, submarines were being destroyed faster than Germany could replace them, and supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union flowed more steadily than before. Hitler's vision of starving his enemies into submission collapsed in the face of overwhelming American capacity. The scale of the miscalculation is clearer when we think about what he might have achieved had he avoided declaring war. If America had been left to fight only Japan, its energy, troops, and resources might have stayed tied up in the Pacific. Europe might have remained a secondary theater for the U.S., with only supplies and money flowing across the Atlantic. Hitler might have gained time to stabilize his front in the East, perhaps even force the Soviets into a stalemate. But by dragging America into the European war, he accelerated his own downfall. The irony is that Hitler often warned against fighting a two-front war, citing Germany's disaster in World War I as the ultimate lesson to avoid. Yet by declaring war on the United States in 1941, he created the exact situation that had destroyed his country a generation earlier. Once again, Germany was locked in a struggle against enemies whose combined strength was far greater than its own. The decision to rely on U-boats as a decisive weapon was part of this flawed thinking. Submarines were dangerous, but they were not war-winning. They could harass, they could inflict damage, but they could not match the flood of men and material crossing the Atlantic. Hitler's obsession with submarine warfare blinded him to the broader reality. Wars are won by industry, manpower, and strategy, not by a single weapon system. And so, by 1942, the consequences of Hitler's miscalculation became clear. America was not paralyzed by the Pacific War, nor was it crippled by submarine losses. Instead, it was building a war machine that would eventually land in North Africa, Italy, and Normandy. His gamble had not bought him time, it had shortened it. His faith in the weakness of American resolve and the strength of his U-boats had turned out to be illusions. Illusions that would cost Germany the war. When Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941, he didn't just gain another enemy, he created something far more dangerous for Germany. He united the Allied powers into a coalition with common cause and shared purpose. Before this point, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States had overlapping interests but also deep tensions and suspicions. They were uneasy partners at best, bound more by circumstance than trust. But Hitler's reckless decision forced them into alignment. Suddenly, all three powers faced the same enemy on both sides of the world, and that clarity of purpose transformed the war. To understand the weight of this, you need to look at how fragile the relationships among the Allies were before America entered the European fight. Britain and the Soviet Union were allies on paper, but in practice, the partnership was strained. Winston Churchill despised communism and had spent much of his career warning against it. Joseph Stalin, in turn, remembered all too well that Britain and France had tried to strangle the Soviet regime in its infancy. After World War I, the two leaders distrusted one another, and their cooperation was born of desperation. Britain needed the Soviets to keep Germany tied down on the Eastern Front, and the Soviets needed Britain to prevent Germany from consolidating Western Europe. The United States, meanwhile, had been helping through the Lend-Lease program, sending food, trucks, and weapons to both Britain and the Soviets. But aid is not the same as alliance. Franklin Roosevelt had to balance public opinion at home, which was still divided about joining a European war, and he knew that a full military commitment in Europe might spark resistance from Congress and the public. Until December 1941, America's role was cautious support, not direct participation. Hitler's declaration changed all of that. Once Germany declared war, Roosevelt no longer had to convince Congress or the American people that Nazi Germany was a direct threat. The decision was made for him. America was in fully and officially, and there was no turning back. For Britain and the Soviet Union, this was the moment they had been waiting for. They no longer had to fight alone, hoping America would one day join them. Now they had the certainty of the world's largest industrial power standing beside them. This new coalition was not just symbolic, it meant practical, concrete cooperation on a scale never seen before. Take intelligence, for example. Before 1941, Britain had been working in secret to crack German codes at Bletchley Park, using the famous Enigma machine. This work was groundbreaking, but limited by resources. Once the United States entered the war, British codebreakers shared their findings, and American cryptographers joined the effort. Together, they created a transatlantic partnership that allowed the Allies to intercept German communications, track U-boat positions, and plan convoy routes. What had once been a British struggle became a combined operation, and the results were devastating for German naval power. Then there was the sharing of technology and production methods. The United States brought mass production techniques that no other country could match. Britain and the Soviet Union had experience fighting Germany on the ground. When these strengths were combined, the result was a war machine greater than the sum of its parts. American factories produced tanks and trucks by the tens of thousands, shipping them to Britain and the Soviet Union. These supplies were not luxuries, they were lifelines. Soviet armies advanced across the steppe in American-made trucks. British pilots flew American-built aircraft in defense of their skies. The coalition's unity meant that no one nation bore the full weight of the war alone. Consider the Soviet perspective for a moment. By late 1941, the Soviet Union was locked in a brutal existential struggle. German forces were deep inside Soviet territory, threatening Moscow itself. The Red Army was suffering catastrophic losses in both men and material. Stalin desperately needed relief. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States ensured that help was not only possible, but inevitable. With American resources flowing into the Soviet Union, the Red Army could rebuild, rearm, and eventually turn the tide at battles like Stalingrad and Kursk. Without that aid, the Soviet war effort might have collapsed under the sheer weight of German pressure. On the British side, the coalition meant survival. Britain had been standing almost alone in Europe since 1940, holding out against the Luftwaffe and keeping the Royal Navy stretched thin across the globe. Every convoy across the Atlantic was a gamble, every shipment of food and fuel a matter of life or death. With America fully in the war, those convoys no longer trickled across the ocean, they surged. American destroyers and escort carriers joined the effort, dramatically reducing losses. The U-boat threat, while still deadly, could no longer strangle Britain into submission. Churchill later admitted that America's entry into the war was the turning point that ensured Britain's survival and eventual victory. The coalition was not without its challenges. The three major allies had different political systems, different war aims, and very different leaders. Roosevelt was a pragmatist. balancing ideals with strategy. Churchill was a statesman steeped in empire, always thinking about Britain's global role. Stalin was ruthless, focused entirely on crushing Germany at any cost. These men distrusted one another, sometimes bitterly. Stalin often accused his Western partners of delaying the opening of a second front in Europe, suspecting that Britain and the US wanted the Soviet Union to bleed itself dry. Churchill and Roosevelt, in turn, worried about Soviet ambitions in Eastern Europe after the war. But Hitler's declaration forced them to set aside those divisions. They all understood that defeating Nazi Germany was the immediate priority. The coalition created through necessity held together because the alternative defeat was unthinkable. They may not have liked or trusted one another fully, but they worked together because they had no choice. This unity was expressed in high-level conferences like those in Tehran and later Yalta, where strategy was coordinated across continents. The power of the coalition was also psychological. For ordinary people in Britain and the Soviet Union, the knowledge that America was fully committed gave hope. Soldiers on the front lines could take comfort knowing they were no longer the only ones fighting. Civilians, enduring bombings, shortages, and occupation, could believe that help was on the way. Even propaganda leaned heavily on this idea of unity. Posters, radio broadcasts, and speeches emphasized the United Nations, the term Roosevelt used to describe the coalition long before the modern organization was born. Germany, on the other hand, now faced a nightmare scenario. Instead of isolating and defeating its enemies one by one, Hitler had united them into a single, coordinated force. Every resource Germany spent fighting the Soviets was a resource not available to counter British and American bombers. Every tank sent to the Eastern Front was one less available to defend France from an Allied invasion. Hitler had transformed what might have been a series of separate wars into a single global conflict in which Germany was hopelessly outmatched. The coalition also made possible operations that no single nation could have carried out alone. The invasion of North Africa in 1942, the bombing campaigns against German industry, and ultimately the DA landings in 1944 required coordination, resources, and manpower on a staggering scale. None of these would have been possible without the unity forged by Hitler's declaration of war. By bringing America into the fight in Europe, Hitler had essentially signed the death warrant of his own regime. What began as an arrogant gamble that America would be too distracted, too slow, and too divided to matter turned into the creation of the most powerful military coalition in history. A coalition that, despite its internal tensions, held firm until the final defeat of Nazi Germany. And it all began with one of Hitler's most reckless decisions. When the United States formally entered the war in December 1941, the world did not change overnight, but the balance of resources did. Wars are not only won by armies in the field, but also by the economies that stand behind them. For nearly 2 years before Pearl Harbor, America had been described as the arsenal of democracy, shipping weapons, food, and supplies to Britain and later to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. But those efforts, though massive, were still limited by political caution. The American public was divided about direct involvement in the European war, and Roosevelt had to tread carefully. All of that disappeared the moment Hitler declared war. Now, the entire weight of the American economy and its unmatched industrial capacity would be turned into a war machine, and it tipped the global balance of power in a way Germany could never hope to match. The scale of America's transformation is difficult to overstate. Before the war, the United States was already the world's largest industrial economy, but its industries were geared toward consumer goods. Factories made cars, radios, refrigerators, and luxury items that reflected a nation emerging from the Great Depression. Within months of the war declaration, those same factories were converted to produce tanks, trucks, and aircraft. Automobile plants that once turned out stylish sedans now produced military jeeps by the hundreds of thousands. Ford's massive plant at Willow Run became famous for producing a B-24 bomber every hour at its peak. Entire assembly lines that once churned out consumer products were stripped down and retooled to deliver weapons of war. The numbers alone tell the story. By the end of the war, the United States had produced over 300,000 aircraft, nearly 90,000 tanks, and more than 70,000 ships of various sizes. These weren't just abstract figures. They were lifelines to the front line. British pilots flew American-built P-51 Mustangs and Spitfire replacements. Soviet troops advanced on German positions in American-made Studebaker trucks, supplied with rations and fuel that had crossed the Atlantic in Liberty ships. Without this overwhelming industrial backing, the war of attrition against Nazi Germany might have dragged on indefinitely or even been lost. The key to America's strength was not just the quantity of production, but the efficiency with which it was organized. Unlike Germany, which relied heavily on forced labor and had to juggle production between civilian needs and war demands, the United States mobilized its economy with extraordinary coordination. The War Production Board oversaw the conversion of industries, ensuring that resources were allocated where they were most needed. Rationing ensured that raw materials like rubber, steel, and aluminum were directed toward war use. Civilian industries adapted, and ordinary Americans accepted shortages at home because they understood it meant victory abroad. Germany, by contrast, struggled to keep up. Hitler had never fully mobilized the German economy in the early years of the war, partly because he wanted to maintain civilian morale, and partly because of internal competition among Nazi agencies. It was not until 1943, under Albert Speer, that Germany attempted a full-scale mobilization of its economy, but by then it was far too late. The Allies, and particularly the United States, were outproducing Germany in every category. In tanks, in planes, in trucks, in artillery shells, the numbers were lopsided. For every German tank rolling off an assembly line, several American or Soviet tanks were ready to meet it. The Atlantic convoys made this imbalance clear. In 1942, German U-boats sank staggering numbers of Allied ships, threatening to choke off Britain's supplies. But America's shipbuilding capacity was so vast that even with losses, the Allies could replace tonnage faster than the Germans could sink it. Liberty ships, the workhorses of the Allied supply system, were designed to be built quickly and cheaply. At first, the Liberty ship took over 200 days to construct, but by the middle of the war, American shipyards had reduced that time to less than 50 days. In one record-setting case, a ship was assembled in just 4 days. Germany's submarine campaign could not keep pace with this industrial surge, and by 1943, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively against them. The war of resources wasn't only about hardware, it was about food, fuel, and logistics. American farms produced enormous surpluses that fed not only U.S. forces, but also Britain and the Soviet Union. Millions of tons of wheat, corn, and canned goods crossed the ocean, keeping populations alive under siege conditions. Fuel, especially oil, was another decisive factor. The United States had vast domestic oil reserves, while Germany was chronically short on fuel, relying on synthetic production and vulnerable supply lines from Romania. American oil fueled not just tanks and ships, but also the Allied bombing campaigns that devastated German industry. When the Allies targeted Germany's synthetic fuel plants later in the war, the lack of fuel crippled German mobility, grounding planes and stalling tanks. One way to see the tipping point clearly is to look at the North African campaign. Before America's entry, Britain had fought a seesaw struggle against German and Italian forces under Erwin Rommel. Supplies were thin, reinforcements slow, and victory always uncertain. Once American production came fully online, the balance shifted. Tanks, trucks, and aircraft poured into North Africa, and by late 1942, the Allies had the resources to launch Operation Torch, the first large-scale Anglo-American invasion of the war. It marked the beginning of the end for Axis forces in Africa, and it would not have been possible without the American industrial surge. The same story repeated itself in Europe. The planning for D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, depended on the sheer volume of American production. Landing craft, trucks, tanks, ammunition, all of it came in quantities Germany could not dream of matching. When the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, they did so with overwhelming material superiority. For every German defending the coast, the Allies had the resources to deploy several soldiers, each backed by an industrial machine that ensured steady supplies of food, fuel, and ammunition. Even in the Soviet Union, where the Red Army bore the brunt of the fighting against Germany, the American contribution of resources was vital. Soviet factories produced tanks and guns in massive numbers, but their transport capacity was limited. American trucks and locomotives kept Soviet armies mobile. Without them, the Red Army might have stalled before reaching Berlin. It is telling that Soviet soldiers often joked that the war was won with American boots, Soviet blood, and British brains. While an exaggeration, the saying captured the essential truth that victory was a coalition effort powered by American industrial might. Germany could not hope to compete in this war of attrition. Every month that passed after 1941, the imbalance grew worse. The Allies could replace their losses. Germany could not. A destroyed American bomber meant another would be built. A sunken ship meant another would soon be launched. German losses, on the other hand, were irreplaceable. The tipping point of resources ensured that even if German soldiers fought with skill and determination, they were fighting a war they could not possibly win. And it all traced back to Hitler's fateful declaration of war. By bringing the United States fully into the conflict, he had unlocked the vast reserves of manpower, industry, and resources that would ultimately drown the Axis powers. The long war of attrition, which Germany had always sought to avoid, became the very battlefield on which it was doomed to lose. When Hitler declared war on the United States, he believed he was showing strength. In his mind, America was a nation of mixed peoples, too divided and too soft to fight a major war. He thought that Germany, already locked in battle with Britain and the Soviet Union, could discourage the Americans from interfering by attacking first, but the reality was the exact opposite. His decision handed Franklin Roosevelt the political and moral justification to unleash the full force of the American military and economy against Germany. What had been a dangerous but still regional conflict in Europe became overnight a truly global war of attrition that Germany was not built to survive. By 1941, Hitler already faced problems he could not solve. The invasion of the Soviet Union had failed to deliver a quick victory. German troops had advanced deep into Russia, but winter stopped them outside Moscow. Casualties were enormous, supplies were short, and the Red Army had shown that it would not collapse easily. At the same time, Britain still resisted in the West, holding firm despite the Blitz and the loss of most of continental Europe. Germany was fighting two major powers already, with a third, Japan, acting independently in Asia. Adding the United States to that list was not just reckless, it was catastrophic. The American declaration of war on Japan after Pearl Harbor did not automatically guarantee U.S. involvement in Europe. Roosevelt wanted to prioritize defeating Germany, but he faced strong domestic opposition. Many Americans saw Japan as the primary enemy and were reluctant to send soldiers across the Atlantic. Hitler solved that problem for Roosevelt by declaring war on the United States on December 11, 1941. Hitler made the choice easy. There was no longer a question of whether America should fight Germany. The decision had been made by Germany itself. In one stroke, Hitler united American public opinion, silenced isolationist voices, and gave Roosevelt exactly what he needed: a clear enemy in Europe. The consequences of this choice became clear almost immediately. Within months, American troops were fighting alongside the British in North Africa. By the end of 1942, they had joined the war in the Mediterranean, and soon after, they were preparing for a direct assault on occupied France. The United States did not just contribute manpower, it supplied the Allies with an industrial engine that overwhelmed the Axis at every turn. Tanks, planes, and ships rolled off assembly lines at a pace that stunned the world. Germany, stretched thin and unable to match this pace, was pulled into a war of attrition it had no chance of winning. One of the best ways to understand the scale of Hitler's mistake is to consider the resources available to each side after 1941. The combined economies of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union dwarfed that of Germany and its allies. America alone produced more steel, more oil, and more food than all of Germany's occupied Europe combined. The war was no longer about who had the better tactics or the most skilled generals. It became a contest of resources, and in that contest, Hitler had chosen to fight against the world's richest economy at its peak. Germany's military might, impressive as it was in 1940 and 1941, could not keep up. Consider air power. In 1942, the Luftwaffe still held an advantage in many areas, but once American aircraft began arriving in massive numbers, that edge disappeared. By 1943, American bombers were striking German cities and industries daily. Escorted by long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang, the Luftwaffe could shoot down planes, but for every bomber lost, another two were being built in American factories. The The skies that once belonged to Germany soon became Allied territory. Not because German pilots were less skilled, but because the enemy could replace its losses indefinitely. The same imbalance appeared on the seas. Germany relied heavily on its U-boat fleet to strangle Britain and disrupt Allied supply lines. For a time, this strategy caused havoc, sinking millions of tons of shipping. Liberty ships and later Victory ships were launched in staggering numbers, restoring lost tonnage and expanding Allied supply capacity. By mid-1943, improved anti-submarine tactics, new technologies like radar, and the sheer weight of replacement ships turned the tide. The Battle of the Atlantic was lost by Germany, not because their submarines stopped being effective, but because Hitler had picked a fight with a nation that could outbuild him by an order of magnitude. Even on land, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. German soldiers were often better trained and equipped than their counterparts, but training takes time, and equipment takes resources. America and the Soviet Union had both in abundance. In North Africa, in Italy, and later in France, the Allies could afford to suffer heavy casualties and still keep pressing forward. Germany could not. Every lost tank, every destroyed aircraft, every casualty drained resources that could not be replaced. The longer the war dragged on, the worse it became for Germany. Hitler's miscalculation also lay in underestimating the speed at which America could mobilize. He assumed that, like in World War I, it would take years before American forces could make a difference. But Roosevelt and his advisors had already been preparing. The draft had begun in 1940, Lend-Lease had been established, and American industry was already shifting toward war production. By the time Germany declared war, the machine was already in motion. Within a year, American troops were fighting overseas. Within 2 years, they were landing in force. Hitler had gambled that he could finish off the Soviet Union and force Britain into submission before America could intervene. Instead, America intervened before either goal was achieved. There is also a political dimension to the blunder. Hitler presented himself as the master strategist, the man who saw further than his generals. But his declaration of war revealed the opposite. His decision was driven by ideology and arrogance rather than clear calculation. He despised Roosevelt and underestimated America's resolve, dismissing it as a nation of businessmen unfit for serious war. He wanted to show loyalty to Japan, his Axis partner. But Japan had never declared war on the Soviet Union, despite their alliance. It was a one-sided commitment that benefited no one but Hitler's enemies. By declaring war, he gave the Allies something they desperately needed: unity. From that point onward, Germany's fate was sealed. Every campaign after 1941 showed the growing weight of Allied power crushing the Axis. In Stalingrad, German troops were surrounded and destroyed as Soviet armies grew stronger, fed by American supplies. In North Africa, Rommel's forces collapsed against a tide of Anglo-American soldiers. In Italy, the Allies invaded and slowly drove north. And in France, the Normandy landings in 1944 marked the beginning of the end. None of this would have been possible without the United States fully committed to the European theater. And that commitment came directly from Hitler's own declaration. It is rare in history to find a single decision that so directly alters the course of events. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States was one of them. By making the choice himself, he ensured that Germany would not only fight Britain and the Soviet Union, but also face the industrial and military might of the United States. What might have remained a prolonged European conflict became a global struggle, one that Germany had no chance of winning. It was a self-inflicted wound, a strategic blunder of the highest order, and it transformed the war into a fight that could end only with Germany's total defeat. And that brings us to the end of this series on Hitler's declaration of war against the United States. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most disastrous decisions in military history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more stories that reveal the strange, the reckless, and the defining moments of our past.